talking back.
Welcome to Decision Space, the only show to take place right here in the space between the turns in your favorite games. I'm Jake Friedman.
And I'm Brendan Hansen.
And this is the podcast about decisions in games.
And in today's episode, we're talking all about scoring logistics. This is going to be a what we talk about style exploration of all the ways games might facilitate their scoring. So it won't just be a conversation on scoring overall or victory points or anything like that. We're going to try to keep this episode as focused as we can on actual scoring logistics. So things like talking about tracks and tokens and scoring sheets and scoring frequency even. All the things that games do to help us score them and how the presentation of those scoring logistics shift the way in which we can engage with the game and make meaningful decisions in the game.
Yeah, that's what I'm most interested in here is the ways that the scoring logistics, the way scoring is actually implemented in the game can affect the decision space of the game. And hey, that's the name of the show.
Great tie-in. And while we're tying in, let's do a quick reading of a review. We always like to do this from time to time when they come in. And it's been a while since we read one out on the show. We certainly welcome you and invite you to leave a review if you enjoy listening to Decision Space, and we'll read your review on the show as well. This particular review is from Joe Nacho 42, and the title is "The Heuristic for This Pod." ... because it got cut off. This has quickly become a favorite podcast. The banter and back and forth makes you smile. I love the deep dives on games. It has also ignited a passion for designers, Reiner Knizia, Rhino Kniz, and Kramer. Thank you so much, Joe Nacho. Super appreciate the review and the shout out and the Rhino Kniz love.
Anybody who uses the word heuristic in a review for this podcast gets extra special brownie points from me.
So that's 6 out of 5 stars?
6 out of 5 stars for that review. Or 11 out of 10, as we say.
Nice.
One other quick update at the start of the show or announcement. We are in the review portion of our first ever Decision Space Jam, which means it's too late to submit an entry. All the entries are in, and we got a whopping 22 entries into this contest.
22 games?
Isn't that insane? 22 people invented games for the purpose of this design jam. And you can play them all right now. There's some really cool games, great games.
For free?
For free. They're all print and play, and they're really simple roll and write. So there's no assembling at all. It's just printing out a sheet. And as long as you have 2 dice or can navigate to random.org or whatever and use the 2d6 module to roll, you can play these games really easy. And we want to encourage all of our listeners to dive in and check out these games, whether just for fun or to give some feedback and help us determine the quote unquote winners of this contest. And there's going to be a special kind of incentive to get people who are interested in this to give reviewing a shot. So we're going to say anybody who plays and gives feedback on 15 games, 15 of the 22 or more, will get 3 special prizes. The first, you'll get a shout out on this very podcast. The second, you will get a special role and name color in our Discord, and that's going to be exclusive to DSJ number 1. If we do this again in the future, it'll be a different kind of role and name color. So that's like special bragging rights for all time for just being a really great community member. And the third prize, we're going to give you access to our Patreon patron exclusive hashtag the bridge channel in our Discord too, where you can join in the conversation there because clearly anyone who's willing to play and give feedback on 15 plus games is a great community member. We'd love to have your input in the Bridge channel. So there you have it. That's your incentive. Get out there and review and play these great games.
That's a lot of stuff. I'm impressed. Yeah. I hope at least some people do that.
Yeah, it's a
And
lot. It's a
it's
lot to
cool.
ask.
It's a lot to ask, but it's cool because you'll get to play a lot of neat games that I think just scanning all of the games that I've seen in and all the games I saw in review, Jake, I'm impressed consistently by the level of ingenuity and the sort of different directions that people have taken these designs in terms of both mechanically and in terms of the themes that have been presented. I think there's lots of fun stuff that is well worth at least one play in terms of igniting your imagination, just having a little fun, chucking some dice and making some decisions and rolling right. So thank you so much to everyone who's participated. And of course, more to come on the Decision Space Jam #1
Yeah.
in the future.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, to do that, you can navigate to our Discord. We'll put a link to that in the description of this podcast. And we're going to do a episode in the future about some of these games. So playing them now is like doing the pre-playing. That's probably going to help you get a lot more out of that fun episode when it comes later at some point.
And now onto our scoring logistics. Just dive right in. Okay, so we talked already at the top about how scoring logistics we're going to define as like an element of the game that facilitates scoring. So that could be tracks or tokens or a score pad, really anything that sort of goes along with it. And I think we'll include in this conversation, are victory points hidden, or is it a binary win-loss condition with no scoring at all? Oh, the frequency of feedback, sort of all of these things. And we'll talk a little bit at the end, maybe even about online play, where the scoring logistics are really automated and how that shifts your experience of play as well. But I think the most important point for us to kind of start with, and I'm curious to hear you talk about this some too, Jake, is that I think that scoring logistics are typically a presentation decision made by the designer and or developer and publisher. And in most cases, you could accomplish scoring in most games with any of these tools, but that presentation decision affects our ability to engage with the game, shifts our focus potentially, and hopefully the goal, right, is makes it easier to get to the fun of the game or enables or equips you in some way. So one example that I'll just sort of jump to, and then maybe we'll come back to it, is, for example, the scoring track in El Grande that goes around the outside of the board in some ways really popularized that scoring track system that we see in so many Euro games, helps players better understand who's actually in the lead, so then they can make more informed decisions about where they should place their cubes in that area control game, vying for locations on a map.
Yeah, well said. All that I agree with. Just to jump back very quickly, I think the thesis maybe of this is, and we'll see if this thesis holds up over the course of this episode, could be that scoring logistics, scoring presentation impacts decision space. And it's something that designers and developers should
Yep.
be thoughtful about because they make a real impact on the game. And I suspect you're exactly right, that often it's an afterthought on how scoring will be presented back to players. And I think we might even find sometimes like evidence of that. And El Grande is a great example of that too, insofar as the kind of hidden trackable information, the way that manifests in the game as well, because famously, El Grande is the game that has a Castillo. It's a big kind of tower on the board where players will dump their meeples of their color or cubes of their color into, hiding them. And then at the end of each round, all players know how much that Castillo space will score for. You'll get 5 points if you're the person who has the most cubes in that tower. But it's hidden information how many are in that tower, so you kind of have to memorize it. But also, you actually don't, because you could simply count for each player on the game how many other cubes they have either in front of them plus on the board to deduct exactly how many are in that tower. So in that way, it kind of is a funny example of the way that this like obfuscated scoring, it changes the way that players play the game, because the way I play the game is I don't do that mental math, right?
Yeah.
It's telling me, the way I interpret the designer is telling me, don't worry too much about this. You won't have as much fun if you're like calculating this each round. Whereas a different way of kind of presenting that scoring opportunity would lead to a different style of play. So a
And
convoluted example that proves the thesis that we're
no,
talking about.
I think it's a really good example. And then to sort of take it further in the context of El Grande completely, right? Kramer and Ulrich, the two designers of that game, could have decided not to have the scoring track around the outside. And instead, whenever a region scores, players take a token worth the number of points that it is and then puts that token behind their screen.
Or face down.
Or face down. So it would be impossible to actually tell who's winning unless you had counted the entire time what everyone had. They didn't make the decision to do that because they wanted players to be empowered by the knowledge of who's actually in the lead at a given point in time. But then with the Castillo, they wanted some fuzziness in terms of the potential, scoring potential, just enough, and giving you that hurdle. And I think that it's really important, right? Because your experience of a game, whether you can do something or can't, like in the case of El Grande, counting the Castillo, just because you can do it doesn't mean you're going to. And making things more difficult disincentivizes your players from doing it, though some players will do it and will have a bad time because they do it, which is something to consider too. But yeah.
What a great example to start with, right? Because therein you have the score track, which is kind of explicitly giving players data that they need to use to make optimal decisions in the game, and also kind of a more subtle use of it with the Castillo that's kind of creating almost a signpost of don't worry too much about this over here.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting example, and I think as we go through some of these other examples, it'll be interested kind of digging into the way scoring presentation is done and what that might be implicitly and explicitly communicating to players.
Yeah. I think that the other big things about a score track too, Jake, is one interesting thing is that
Talking about
score tracks in the section. Yes. Is that one, the whole idea of them, right, is kind of this idea that happens in El Grande, putting one on a board for players to have. And when we say score tracks, I guess we should be as explicit as possible. This is like a track that is somewhere in front of the players on the table. Oftentimes this will go around the outside of the board, but it's a track that all players or pieces are on and that everyone can easily see, that shows exactly how many points a player has scored, at least in the context of this track. And I think that this came into vogue sort of in the 90s with games like El Grande. I know it came into being even before that, a different game by Wolfgang Kramer.
Yeah, it's Kramer who's credited with kind of
designing it. Yeah.
Specifically the score tracker on the outside of the board.
Exactly. And I think the game is called like Ulrich. No. I can't even remember what the game is. Go back and listen to our Kramer and Kiesling episode, Design Space, and we talk about sort of which game this was originally featured. But I think that these come into vogue in part with the Eurogame movement of the 90s and early 2000s, sort of saying, we want you to be able to make rational, informed decisions in our games, right? That the philosophy and thinking here is that score tracks enable you to make more informed decisions. And I think most of the time that's true, but not always. I have another example of score tracks in the game kind of facilitating this, but also kind of not, because there's other elements in that game that make the score track not exactly the whole picture. So that's Ticket to Ride. Ticket to Ride has a score track that goes around the outside of the board. And when this is a game that whenever you lay down trains and complete a route, or at least routes between cities, you get to score. And you score a certain number of points for them. You move your marker up around the board, but you also, hidden to everyone, have tickets in your hand that you don't just turn them in the second you complete them. Let's say you have to get from New York to New Orleans or something, and it's worth, this is totally hypothetical, 12 points. You don't, the second you make that happen, reveal that to the table and then move up the score track. You actually keep those hidden until the very end of the game. So throughout the course of play, let's say I'm trying to make a blocking decision, and I have equal ways that I could go. I could either block Jake or I could block Jared. I might look at the score track and say, oh, Jake's ahead on the board. I guess I'll block Jake, but there could be a chance that Jared would have a ton of points off of tickets. So it's sort of this in between where it says, I want you to be somewhat informed, but I don't want you to know exactly what's going to happen. And I think there's a real benefit to that, which is that it makes it makes it such that if you fall really behind, like in El Grande, you can fall behind enough in that game that you can kind of know you're out of it by the mid game. And that feels sort of bad. So Ticket to Ride, which is designed to be a little bit more of a mainstream sort of family-friendly game, that's a problem. You don't want people to disengage halfway through the game. So Alan R. Moon solves that by saying, okay, I still want the score track. I want you to say, Jake's winning, so I have a justification for blocking you, Jake. But at the same time, I still have hope if I'm not in the lead on the score track the whole time, because maybe I've completed more tickets than everyone else. I have a big hand of tickets. Maybe it's going to be a jackpot at the end of the game that pushes me over. And I think that's a nice in between. And that's just a decision, right? A presentation decision, a mechanical decision too, in the case of Ticket to Ride, that really affects the play experience. And it didn't have to be that way. Alan R. Moon could have said, when you finish a route, just reveal it, and the score track is what the score track is. But I think a lot of what makes that game accessible is that decision to not put out the whole truth on the score track.
Yeah, that brings up an interesting case about score tracks, which is that it can be really misleading too. Where I think and potentially this is an argument for when a score track might not around the outside of the board might not be the best presentation for your game, at least insofar as facilitating a really fun first kind of or learning play situation, which is when there's when a game gives players the opportunity to kind of knock each other down in some way. And then there's a score track on the outside, and then there's also a lot of end game scoring, which can create a situation where a player runs ahead on the score track and is seemingly ahead, and so they start getting kind of beat down while somebody using a different kind of strategy, maybe like end game scoring cards or something along those lines, is actually kind of then was in front and is now more in front because of their scoring being hidden. So I think that's something to consider if you're kind of designing a game or developing a game. You know, if a majority of your points are coming from somewhere other than score track, you know, maybe you don't want to put that first and foremost in front of all the players.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I kind of wonder what my threshold would be for sort of saying, you know, if more than, obviously I don't want 10% of the points in the game.
I'm having a hard time thinking of a good example, but I know I've like experienced this before.
Yeah.
I think Hansa Teutonica is one.
Yes, totally.
It kind of have that where somebody's like doing really well on points on the track, but somebody else could be having way more points coming from somewhere else, but they're not the ones getting blocked all the time.
Yeah.
Especially with a new group.
Definitely. I think also, Jake, do you agree with the idea that really in most cases a score track is most useful in really interactive games? In less interactive games, oftentimes a score track just feels less necessary. If I don't have the ability to interact with whoever is in the lead, there's not as many reasons why I might, as a player, want to exactly know who's in the lead. It's going to take some of the drama of play away. Like for the reasons we talked about with runaway leaders and something like El Grande. So I think in general, I like score tracks in games where I have some ability or some agency to meaningfully interact with the player who's in the lead. So I'm not just getting negative feedback if I'm losing and positive feedback if I'm winning, right? But it gives me a directive. And then also just within the course of play, it gives me a reason outside of politics to say, Jake, sorry, I have to do this. You're in the lead. The game's showing me that, right? It takes some of the potential negative feelings and gives players something that they can point at. Hey, we have this shared information. I'm doing it because of that. I'm not doing it because of bad feelings, right?
Yeah. I think it can soften the blow for sure. And I think another just advantage of score track as a presentation is it's typically like a pretty easy way to handle scoring just like over the course of play. And you know, just around the edge of a board that you already have is not really taking up prime real estate. So I get why I get why it's become popular, both because it has like great utility to the game, a lot of advantages in the right type of game to presenting score in that way, and also just because it's nice design, right? It's like I feel like you're using the space well that you have.
I think also a score track does a really good job of quantifying feedback for players. So what I mean by this is when I'm playing Ticket to Ride and I lay down a route with 3 trains and I get to move up 5 points or whatever, that feels good. I like to move up tracks that are shared with other players. I like the dopamine hit I get of scoring. But when I do that and it's one of the routes that has 6 trains or whatever in it, Jake, and I get to move up 25 points or whatever it is, and you just move all that distance, it feels really meaningful. You get slightly more nuanced feedback in terms of just visually, I'm seeing, okay, look at all this range I'm crossing on this board versus if I just grabbed a 25 point token. It almost is facilitating a similar thing between, you know, when you're reading a book physically, like one of those like printed on paper books, and you get closer to the end, it's giving you that sense of feedback of, okay, I've gone through this number of pages. Whereas when you're reading a book digitally and you're just reading a PDF, you don't necessarily have that same sensation. I think that in
Yeah.
some ways, stick with me with this metaphor, scoring tracks are the physical books of scoring, and something like tokens are more like digital books in terms of reading and the feedback that's there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
You're like medium with
let's.
me. Great.
I was
Let's keep
kind of
going.
with you more, but let's get on to tokens.
Wait.
Oh,
I have
okay.
one point. Can we talk about
All right.
Babylonia really quickly?
Of course, Brendan. This is
Yes.
your 2 minutes on Babylonia that I forgot to budget this week.
I'm glad to be able to take it back. Sneaking it up above the bottom line. I think so. Babylonia is a Knizia game with a scoring track that goes around the outside. And I think interestingly, Knizia is a designer who doesn't use a ton of score tracks. He uses all these implementations of that we've kind of mentioned, tracks, tokens, and pads. But Babylonia has one. And I think there's a reason. It's a really interactive game. And I'll also say Babylonia for me, Jake, highlights the sensation of the feedback you get when you loop the scoring track. So you go all the way around once, crossing 100. You know you're having a good game. That feels really good, right? It's almost like breaking a record in an arcade game or something, right? The game is giving you this direct feedback. We made the scoring track go to 100. You broke it. You must be doing great.
Yeah.
Whether or not that's true or not, right? Like the scoring track could go to 10 and it could be a 100-point scoring game or something.
It's a really nice way of signposting to players what a good score is, because if you have a score track going around the outside of the board, it could be a lot of little tiny spaces, right? And there's like 200 spaces there, or it could be like 50. And both those things tell players, communicate something very differently to players about how valuable gaining 3 points is in the game.
It can also be a little bit of a consolation prize. If you lose, but it was a game where everyone looped the score track, you can sort of feel like, well, I played well. Everyone else just played really well, but I still have this accomplishment. I can walk away from the game and say, I've looped the score track playing Babylonia.
You can also take pictures of it at the end of the game, and it's really satisfying to say, like, oh, look how closely we're bunched together.
Yeah.
That doesn't feel the same way
with a pile of tokens.
When a pile of tokens, people are just like reading out their score out loud. Like the game's already passed, where it feels like we're sort of still in it. I feel more accomplished in a game when I kind of like have that piece moving around the board. I think like manifesting what I've done in the game.
Yeah, and if all the points are tracked on the score track, like a game like Babylonia, it has the potential to really increase the sense of drama, because if it's a close game, it's a close game while you're playing, and you can all see it and experience it. The other thing, though, that Babylonia highlights
is score tracks the GOAT, dude.
I think they might be. We'll get into it, but I think they might be.
There's a lot of good things about it. I didn't even realize how much we're good about it until we start talking about it. Not perfect, not always for every game, but yeah.
It's true. Well, one thing Babylonia does highlight is the frequency of scoring issue with score tracks potentially. In Babylonia, you basically score every game, and this is a pretty common complaint levied at the game, that because you're always scoring, I think that some players feel like it gets to be like a little bit too much upkeep, kind of like you have to, do the dishes at the end of every turn and move your score marker up the track. And I wonder, as a thought experiment, if players would feel the same if they were just grabbing a token every turn, but then counting at the end. I think that it just gets a little bit, because you're doing it every turn. Maybe you're reaching all the way across the table to move your marker, or telling someone else to, that if it was just grabbing tokens from a pile, maybe you wouldn't have that same feedback. Obviously, there'd be downsides to doing it that way too, given everything we just discussed that's great about score tracks in terms of informed decisions. So I think Knizia probably made the right decision, but he could have done it the other way, and maybe people wouldn't say, oh yeah, the scoring's a huge bear in that game.
Knizia feels like a designer that is not just arbitrarily coming
no, he
to
thinks
a way
about
of
this a lot.
Right, because he's kind of, his whole MO is like the scoring system being the game.
Yep.
And yeah, so probably a lot of good Knizia examples for each of these scoring systems that we're going to talk about. And next, we're going to talk about tokens. But yeah, probably if you're playing a Knizia designed game that has the way the scoring are logistically done, is probably highlighting the strengths of that system.
Totally. Do you want to kind of lead into tokens, Jake, or do you want me to?
Well, tokens are different from hidden victory points, which are also almost always tokens. I see that as a separate section. I'm wondering if we should kind of bunch them together. But what I think you mean by tokens is you're getting some kind of physical object over the
Yeah.
course of the game and taking it into your personal supply, whether that's hidden or revealed, that tells you how many points you have when you add them all together.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think that maybe we can group those two sections together because I think to your point, so I'll relocate it in our notes. But to your point, I think there's a spectrum here, right? In terms of how much information is open in terms of tokens versus closed. So a game of that has tokens that comes to mind for me is Patchwork. Patchwork, whenever you score, you just get little tokens that denote how many points you have. But in Patchwork, their tokens are fairly large. They're little button tokens, and I can fairly easily look across the table. Patchwork's a 2-player game, so I only have to count one other person's tokens and sort of count them up if I wanted to and get a real sense for them, which is completely different than something like Tigris and Euphrates, a game with token-based scoring, more or less, that's hidden behind a screen, intentionally obfuscating it so players can't see them.
Yeah, but there can also be kind of stuff that's in between the two, right?
Yep.
Where it's sometimes like you can't hide how many tokens you have, but you keep them face down or how much money you
Yeah.
have or something like that. Which, so I think you can kind of maybe one of the strengths of this scoring system is that it does allow for a lot of kind of turning. It gives you a lot of flexibility in how much you want to turn the dial up on public, private information,
Yeah.
going all the way to completely public if you want to do the counting, to completely hidden behind a player sheet, or something in between.
Yeah. And oftentimes the things we remember most about a game aren't the experience of playing it, but how the game ends. So tokens force endgame counting, right? Which, because you're not sort of tracking it on a score track, at the end of the game, everyone has to count up your tokens. Counting up your tokens is not necessarily fun, just sitting there and doing some sort of tallying of your points, but it does mean that typically it adds this dramatic reveal where players have to all say how many points they scored. So it leaves you, if there is a really close game, with potentially this really dramatic moment right at the end that punctuates the end of the experience that can be really fun. And there's different ways you could do this, right? Where you say, okay, has anyone scored 70? Does anyone score 80? And you kind of keep going until you see. And then maybe once you pass some threshold, you say, okay, just say your numbers on the count of 3 or something. And that can be really exciting. But maybe you lose some of the tension during play because you don't have as strong of a sense of how everyone's doing without the score track just kind of representing it.
Yeah, my group kind of does like the mini game of whoever thinks they got last has to just kind of say theirs first, and
That's a fun one.
we try and like feel it out till we get all the way to the
The
two
winner.
people at the end
Yeah.
who we think maybe won. I don't know if we've ever intentionally stated that, but that's the way it usually seems to go. And
Nice.
also, I will say, for counting up at the end, I don't think that's a token thing, because I mean, like, if you just have stacks of money in like modern art, it's not hard to create little sets of 100 or whatever.
Sure.
It doesn't take too much time. I think the really painful thing at the end of the game is when you're like have to like reference a bunch of things, like, okay, I got like the 3-time modifier for green territories, and now I'm like looking at all the board, right, and like trying to like count out different subgroups of scoring, which could be a way that tokens could score if you're like collecting, like doing like getting tokens that score for sets or whatever, like, I don't know. But I don't think it's like tokens inherently themselves
Sure.
are too bad at the end of the game. And oftentimes score tracks, fair is fair, has like end game scoring
Right.
that we're doing the same thing, and they're like, okay, okay, everybody scored for this. All right, now we're moving everyone up the score track for all
I just
those
don't like
things.
counting tokens.
Okay.
But I hear you, because even score pads, which we'll talk about in a minute, certainly have that same problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's just games that have a lot of end game
End game
scoring
scoring.
are long, regardless of the thing. One thing I was going to say about tokens, though, Brendan, is I think it can be a seamless way to like introduce randomness
Yeah.
into your scoring. If you want to like infuse just a bit of luck in your game, so challengers is a good example of that. I see we have listed here, where at the end of each round, as of course, if you listen to this podcast, Challengers is a game where you play a series of one-on-one card battle duels, and then each round, the winner of those duels gets a trophy, and those trophies are worth increasingly large amounts of points over the course of the 7 rounds of the game. But not all round 1 trophies are created equal, and so on and so forth for each round of the game. They'll all be relatively close, but you won't know exactly what players have, and that adds kind of a fun. It adds excitement to the reveal at the end of the game. It also adds excitement throughout the game as when you win one of these trophies. It's kind of exciting to see, and it creates a. I think what it does is it really smartly uses token scoring to create mystery that keeps things more competitive seeming for more players over the course of this game that's going to have at a minimum 7 rounds of play.
Totally. I'll also say, Jake, I think that from in terms of a player experience, it's fun to get tokens, right? So I mentioned the dopamine hit of moving up the Ticket to Ride track. I think that I really love in Ticket to Ride when I get to just move up 25 spaces or whatever. And when Babylonia, you score a city and you move up 30 points. That feels awesome. It's not as much fun to just move up 2 or 3 points. It's kind of an opposite version of feedback where it can almost feel bad because you see how much you don't move. But I think tokens are the opposite. In a game, whenever you get tokens and you score, it feels good. Like if I'm taking one button in Patchwork, it feels good. If I'm taking
Hey,
a little handful of buttons, it feels good. Like I like grabbing the stuff.
It's a really funny image of you moving 1 space forward on a scoring track that goes up to 100 and be like, oh, I wanted to move 100 spaces forward.
Yeah, exactly. I think that matters though. And no, it's a great point about the sort of variable scoring. I think Jaipur also uses that mechanism in terms of the size of sets that you turn in, or maybe something like that. Gives you some variable rewards. Also, Vadis uses that same mechanism where you could take tokens from the board and you don't necessarily know exactly how many points will be on the other side.
Wait, really? I think Stuvadis, don't you know?
Do you know? Okay, maybe
I
you
think you
do
know in
know.
that one, but
Maybe
definitely
you
in
do
a
know.
lot of
Okay.
games they have randomized elements.
Well,
What
maybe
I
we could do
what
the
I
Zuvadis episode and then we would know it for sure.
we would know
Okay.
for sure, and then everyone would know.
Yeah, then
You're
everyone
right.
would.
That's my
Yeah.
bad. That's my bad.
Yeah. Okay.
The other great thing about tokens, speaking of Zuvadis, is that they're transferable. You
Yes. Yeah.
mentioned how it going up on a track feels less satisfying than maybe getting a token. You know what feels
Yeah.
really satisfying? When somebody has
Taking
to give you one of
yeah.
their tokens.
Reach over
That
and snatch
feels
it.
the best.
Yeah.
And it's just just from a usability standpoint, if a lot of that type of exchange is happening in the game, way smoother to do it with a stack of tokens than moving
Someone
your
down.
player piece up a track and somebody else down a track.
It's also more memorable, right? When you give someone a token, if you have
Yeah,
to,
you
or you
feel
take it from
that.
someone, you look them in the eyes and you feel it. Yeah. Versus just
Yeah.
moving down the track. It's
Yeah.
not as cerebral or immediate of an experience.
Or if you play the Emperor in Dune, you let the whole table know right away that you will only accept a token that is placed into your hand. You will not be scooping it off the board,
Love it.
you know, as one does, right?
Totally. The other thing about tokens, like you said, Jake, is they can be exchanged, but they can also be integrated into the play space. So, hey, that's my fish is an example of this, right? Or, even Zuvadas that we just talked about, where they're randomly set out on the board. And hey, that's my fish. The board is physically made up of scoring tokens that show a different number of fish, and it's randomly set up. And on your turn, you're trying to collect those tokens by when you move away from a space, you pick up the token you're under, and then that's just your scoring. So tokens make it such that you can variably set up scoring in a game and make them a component of play much more immediately than something like a scoring track, which is a more abstract representation of progress. And I think that that's interesting and important because it means you can variably or randomly set up the scoring of a game a little bit more easily potentially, or with fewer components than maybe with a score track or something like that.
Yeah, definitely. So it's a really, really versatile component, and also, as with any of these, right, they can all be integrated. You can have more than one
Yeah.
in a game as well. Brendan, is
Wait,
money a token?
I think absolutely
Yeah,
yes.
like
Money is a token. Paper
paper
money
money
is a
games,
token.
that
Yeah.
fits into this category too.
Modern art is a token based
And, and
scoring game.
And paper money is a funny one as well because it can kind of create. I think there are games, and I know there are games that you can like you have to keep your money visible to players, but you can like stack it up,
Sure.
right? So
Yeah.
like so I know I can't recall it now. So somebody will have to remind me in the Discord where I've been playing a game and you're just trying to like compare people's stacks
Stacks. Yeah.
to
That's
know
good.
who has money without being sure exactly what the denomination of those bills
Yeah,
is.
you make a stack of ones that's really tall and then slap 100 on
Right,
top of it.
exactly.
Yeah,
And you're
yeah,
like, I
yeah.
got a lot of money. You don't want to mess with me.
Yep. The other thing, really quickly, just to jump back for one sec about the integrating tokens into a play space, like in the "Hey, that's my fish" example, Jake, is I think a cool thing about doing something like that is that the scoring logistics could provide a reason for taking points, a certain number of points, beyond just getting that number of points. So what I mean by that is that in a game like "Hey, that's my fish," you might go to a space that's worth fewer points because you're going to block someone. So if it was not represent like block someone from physically moving and prevent their future action. So it provides a little more vector of nuance around how much certain spaces are worth because it's now a physical sort of component within the game where you have to consider both what it's worth to you in terms of endgame points, but also what it's worth to you in terms of position on the board. And that's kind of cool because it means that you have this sort of nuanced take for every location where it has a point value and a blocking value depending on the board that evolves organically throughout the course of play.
Yeah, preceding a board with tokens is going to add a lot to the setup, but I
Yeah.
think it's actually a really great way of adding variability to a game without a lot of rules overhead.
Overhead. Yeah.
If there's different scoring allotments or in different areas, that's going to encourage people to go to those areas differently depending on the amounts. And if that's random, I think that's good. Where you could do the exact same thing, by having like special powers or like different cards there, but all those other things would inherently increase the rules complexity. So I think that in this sense, the scoring variability with tokens is a nice tool for designers to kind of have in their utility belt.
Totally. We said we talk a little bit about hidden tokens, Jake. So
Yeah.
some examples of that are games like Tigris and Euphrates, where it's open scoring, but then you put them behind a screen so you could count them. In modern art, you're scoring, all your money sits behind your screen. And then these are all Knizia examples. Then in Zuvadis, your tokens are also hidden behind a screen once you collect them. And I think something interesting here is the hiding of victory points in these cases is either trying to stop politicking, so players making certain decisions because someone's in the lead. For example, in modern art, if if everyone's money was just tracked on a board and you could see, auctions might not play out as organically because you could say, oh, I can't afford to buy this painting from Jake. He has the most money and I can't afford to give him any more money. We have to short Jake because Jake's ahead on money. So when everyone bids, we're metagaming, right? We're saying let's think about the score that Jake has as much as what this painting is worth. And by hiding the points, the money in modern art, Knizia is saying, I want you to focus on the auctions. I don't want you to play the metagame of thinking about who already has the most money or who has the least too much. I want it to be fuzzy. And he's doing the same thing in Tigris and Euphrates. I'll say that I think in Zuvadis, though, Jake, the hiding of it, I think is meant to enable politics.
Yeah.
Because what do you think?
I think it's more nuanced than you're making it out to be. I think
Okay.
politics can definitely happen in modern art as well as Zuvadis.
Sure.
It's just Zuvadis is like telling you on its box that
And
this is
giving
a
you other tools.
negotiation game and giving you
Yeah.
other tools to do it. But I don't think that means it's not a smart, intentional choice by Reiner Knizia. What I think it's telling players is like, don't sit here and math out how much money people have.
Sure.
That's not going to be fun. It reminds me a little bit more of the Castillo and El Grande, where
Yeah.
it's facilitating smoother play. But I mean, you can politic as much as you want in modern art, and I'm sure
I
there
guess
are
you could.
groups
Yeah.
doing exactly that. Like it happened in my recent play of it, where people are
Bridget's
just like,
loaded. Yeah.
or somebody's like already got two of those red paintings and the whole table's like, oh, I'd be ashamed if nobody else put any more red paintings up for auction this round. Yeah,
Is that it then puts the player focus on the paintings that are in front of everyone's
right,
screen, right?
more than the money. i
Yeah.
think
So
i think i think you're right. I just think I agree with your take, Brendan.
okay.
Really good
Thank you.
take.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I was just trying to like add some more nuance to it, not
No, and I
disagree.
think you're right, but I think that's a really good example, right? Is Knizia could have made the decision in modern art to have it be open, but then instead of just all sort of talking about paintings, and people like when they talk about modern art to say, oh, that's a thematic Knizia. I really feel like it's simulating the kind of art dealing world and it comes through. And I think if you were all sitting around talking about like, oh, Bridget has the most money, we can't buy Bridget's paintings, that the mystique of the theme starts to look a little thinner than it does without the implementation that it has, where it keeps you focused on maybe make politicking about the paintings because that's what you can see and that's what you can engage with because that's what Rhino Kniz said you could look at.
Brendan, are you a paper money guy?
Okay, so like,
Or are you anti-paper money?
I think I just like money in games. When I first started really talking about and engaging with online conversations about board games, I ran into a lot of hate about paper money, and I didn't really get it because growing up, I always loved playing with paper money. And I think I have fond memories even of just playing games like Monopoly with paper money. I just
Right.
think it's fun. I like it. I don't mind at all. How about you?
Yeah, no, I'm with you 100%.
Millennium Blades? Give me the rolls.
Yeah, I think, if you talk about like a thematically evocative component to a
Yeah.
game, money,
Yeah.
paper money, that's a premium component. I think bring it back. Yeah, I mean, maybe it was Santiago is the game that I played that had paper money that we were putting in stacks
Nice.
to see how much people had. But that was another kind of game I played recently that had paper money. And like you, coming into the hobby, I saw a lot of hate for it and kind of assumed that must be right. But I think a lot of games genuinely might benefit from having made the choice of paper money as opposed to tokens
Sure.
representing money.
Hi-
It's just less thematic. Also, like, I don't like making change. I
no,
hate
yeah.
that's something that's a problem with token games, like even like a modern art. Like making change is a pain in the ass, and also it could even like reveal information that's supposed
Yeah.
to be hidden and kind of. I'm not that it's like a big deal or a deal breaker in any way, but if I have to make change in a game, I would much rather be making change with paper money than tokens. I
Yeah.
think.
High Society is a game, Jake, where I feel like paper money. Okay, so it can't have paper money because High Society, everyone has the hand of cards, and the cards represent money, and they really need to be cards. I think. I mean,
It'd
you
be
could
kind of
do it with
weird.
money.
It could be paper money with like a unique back
Back,
of it,
sure.
but yeah, that
It's
one's
easier to hold a hand of cards,
yeah, I like
but
that one being cards. If you have
I
to hold a
agree.
hand, I want anything. And you know me, I'm anti hand of tokens.
It's true. You are anti hand of tokens, but I
I
was
think
going
I'm
to
also
say
anti hand of money.
I do think yeah, no, I'm with you that High
I,
Society is
I
implemented
think
how it would be, but it would feel exciting if you were just throwing down cash.
I think it's Quinn's and Shut Up and Sit Down who talks a lot about how like basically a hand of cards is one of the most like satisfying thing about card games. Like
Yeah,
don't do card games with tokens or something else.
totally. Okay, should we talk about pads?
Pads.
Scoring pads. Okay.
Oh, I thought we were talking about PlayStation 5 controllers, which some players use in fighting games instead
Oh
of
my
like
gosh.
a fight stick.
No,
Is that
in this case, we're talking about a good old fashioned piece of papier, just some paper to write down your points on at the end of the game. So, examples, Jake, that came to mind for me of recent ish games with scoring pads. I think scoring pads have fallen out of vogue a little bit because of things like the score track. Are games like Cascadia. Cascadia does not have a board. It's harder to do scoring tracks without a board. So they put a pad in. They could have obviously added a board to the box, but I imagine that would have been more expensive than a scoring pad. And Blue Lagoon is another game, another Knizia example, that actually has a scoring pad. And I think that the interesting thing about scoring pads is it helps you keep track of if there's a lot of scoring vectors in the game, right? If there's lots of juxtaposed or overlaid goals, oftentimes scoring pads are nice because they give players end game feedback about what categories they did well in versus what categories they did poorly in. That if you just had a track and you went category by category and moved your piece up the track, the feedback would get lost in the mix, right? If in Cascadia, there was just a shared little board where you scored on there at the end of the game, and first we did bears. Okay, I moved up 10, Jake moved up 12. Then we do salmon. I move up 25, Jake moves up 30. I can't look back on that and say, oh, where did I go wrong? Where did Jake beat me? Right? But if there's a pad, I can look and say, okay, in this category and in this category, Jake edged me out. So that's why he won. it gives you more nuanced endgame feedback to make more informed decisions next time. So I think a little bit more puzzly games tend to benefit from pads. Calico, another example of that, another game from Flat Out Games, the publishers of Cascadia, also has a scoring pad. And I think those accentuate the strengths of these puzzly games, but they can also lead to kind of tedious, anticlimactic endings somewhat. My least favorite part of Cascadia is the scoring.
Yeah, I think pads are like a necessary evil in
Sure.
that if at the end of the if there's a lot of scoring in your game and it all or mostly all comes at the end, then a scoring pad is probably the best way to logistically implement scoring. There are a lot of games I've played, and I'm thinking of score track games here mostly,
Mm,
where you hardly use the score track until the very end of the game.
yeah.
And then I've had the thought before, like, I really wish, and that I think that slows it down to not have a pad where everybody can just
Yeah.
simultaneously calculate their score, where you're kind of like doing this thing. All right, now everybody's scoring for blue tiles, and like you have to like go around the table. Everybody says it. You move everybody's tokens. Like now we're doing green tiles. I think Apiary is a game I played recently that has scoring tracks, but also mostly it's end game scoring. And
Mm,
I hope I'm not misremembering, and there actually is a scoring pad. But I think I remember playing that game thinking like, yeah, this probably would be a little bit smoother at the end game if it was just done with
a
a scoring
pad.
pad. Yeah.
I will say a cool thing about scoring pads is that, Jake, you talked about how on a scoring track, sometimes you'll take a picture of the score track at the end. If there's a scoring pad, you often don't have to because you have this whole history/log of your plays. Because if you keep your score pad together, you can go back, and oftentimes those score pads invite you to write your names on them. So you can see players' scores increase over time. You can see who won. You can go back and count them. My wife have talked about how when our first son was born, we played over 100 games of Cascadia, and we only knew that because we played through the whole score pad and we counted. And that was really fun. And we got to go back and sort of see who had won the most games and count that up in retrospect when we decided we really cared and we wanted to see. And I think it sort of has the potential of endearing your players to the game a little bit if they follow along with that behavior and kind of keep it around. It's kind of like the benefit of, at the end of a roll and write, you have this artifact of play. At the end of a scorepad game, you also have an artifact.
Yeah. I like that score pads have this built-in history to
Yeah.
them, and I think a lot of us, I don't personally, but a lot of players I game with use board game stats to kind of
Mm,
create their own history
sure.
for games. We just enter everything in. But for those of us who are not
Who read paper books?
dedicated enough, I guess, to remember to do that every time, and then they end up with worthless stats, so they stop using them.
Yeah.
Thinking of a friend I know,
Hey, it's
it's
me.
nice having
Oh,
games
wait,
with
it's
score
you.
pads, and I
Yeah.
think that it's not just nice to because I want to like mine the data. It's nice because it's like, oh yeah, I played this game with my mom that one time, and
Yeah.
we were
Yeah.
playing with like crayons, and now I have like a memory of that
Totally.
game of quicks that we played.
Yeah.
Or right, exactly. You could like, oh yeah, we were using Sharpies. That's all we had, and we were in
Yeah.
on vacation or something like that.
Yep. It is
So
amazing how they can transport you.
yeah, and I think there's something. I guess it's not a surprise for those of us in this like analog hobby that it's nice to have like an actual physical object of that. The other thing I'll say about scoring pads is like when we got this category, it's like I don't like this scoring system just because I think it does indicate that it's probably mostly for games that have a lot of end game scoring,
Mm-hmm.
but that's not the scoring pad's fault. But the good way, the scoring pads that I do like are roll and write games where the scoring pad is the game, like
Yeah,
which is
that's true.
like that's like Quicks or 21 or Welcome to. These are all games where you literally just write straight onto the scoring pad as your game unfolds,
Yep.
and then the scoring is instant at the end because you've already been kind of filling out the whole time.
Totally.
I
I
just
do
think that's a
think
really cool way of using it.
definitely.
Yahtzee too.
I think that's a great point, Jake. The scoring pads also, I think, can be helpful for games just in terms of allowing players, giving you a visual reminder of what you are going to score at the end of the game, or helping players not forget to score certain elements. So in a game like Blue Lagoon, where you're scoring on a ton of different categories, if you didn't have a score pad, you could still potentially accomplish it, but you might forget that you were going for a certain thing that you could score in a certain category. And it's this nice reminder, okay, score this, then this, then this, then this, then this, right? You don't have to go to the rule book. It's represented on the score pad. It holds your
Yeah.
hand a little bit in a way that makes the user experience of scoring, though maybe not perfect, a little bit cleaner if there's a lot of categories.
Yeah, I'm thinking about Apiary again too, and also kind of your like data mining, where like Apiary is a game that has a lot of different avenues to score points. Like
Yeah.
you could use different strategies,
Yeah.
and it gives you a lot more it would if it existed in that game give you a lot more context to your plays rather than just the score that you're going to see in board game stats. A lot of people are writing down their score, but they're probably not going to write 100 points, and I went really big on the queen's favor track with a little bit of farming, where
Totally.
you could see that on a score track.
Yep. Which I
It's
love.
Yeah, which is cool.
Yeah.
We kind of get the benefit of that in some like online implementations of games
Yeah.
where you might be able to get a little bit more data, but traditionally, you're not going to get any data like that in your physical play of games that don't use this type of scoring presentation.
Totally. So that's kind of, I feel like the rub on scoring tracks.
Yeah,
Another thing that I could think of,
scoring
Jake,
pads.
scoring, yeah, pads, excuse me, is games that, and this is a spectrum because I think a lot of games have mechanically integrated scoring, but some games take that to the sort of a really interesting extreme. So here's what I mean by that. In Dominion, you are playing this deck building game in which you are building a deck of cards that you're shuffling and playing to do collect money that you're going to use to buy more cards and then take actions to get more cards to hopefully draw more money. But another thing you're doing is that you're trying to buy these endgame victory points. And that's actually how you win. These are a token that you take from the table. You have to buy it with the money that you've collected into your deck. And then you put that token directly into your deck. And that token throughout the course of play does nothing. It's effectively a blank card. So you have an incentive to not get those tokens, those scoring cards, into your deck too early because they're going to slow your deck down, gum it up, and make it less effective of a little machine that you can run. But at the same time, you need to get them in your deck because you can't win unless you get the most points in your deck by the end of the game. So it mechanically integrates the scoring logistics into the game itself and creates this really interesting emergent decisions around timing and when to actually pursue endgame scoring that you wouldn't make if in Dominion just sort of every time you could buy an estate, you get that many points, right? If I can buy a duchy, if I get to 6 money and I spend my 6 money, I move up a score track 5 points. That's so much less interesting of a game. And I think Dominion doesn't become the game that it is with so much success in creating a genre if it doesn't have this mechanically integrating the scoring by putting a token into your deck and making it a play piece. And then like points as money is another example of this, right?
Yeah.
Anytime you're spending money.
Yeah, before we go off Dominion, I think that's a really interesting case, and it feels unique to me. I was thinking about other deck building games. Lost Ruins of Arnak is one where you can buy cards that give you points, right? This
Yep.
card's worth some points, but that's just one piece of sort of the point salad that's going into the game, and ultimately we're just going to be at the end
Counting
calculating
up all
our
the stuff.
scores and moving up a score track.
Yep.
So it does feel distinct in that way, and I'm trying to. It's almost like a kind of a unique to like the engine building
Yeah.
type of game, like a waxing decisions phase game, right? At some point where you're
Yeah.
gonna then like elect to give up your engine to start scoring points. I think that
Totally.
exists in other places as well. But yeah, I mean, presentation of when we think of just scoring logistics, like the presentation of all your points being on these kind of singular cards that are going into
Yeah.
your deck, I can't think of anything else exactly like that.
One small, just to highlight it, because I think maybe if we can't think of more examples, this could jog in our listeners other examples for them, which will be cool because then they can come to the Discord and tell us about these examples. But Hey, That's My Fish is kind of, that I mentioned earlier, is like a lighter example of this, right? Where I mentioned the whole blocking example where I might opt to go to a space that will score me fewer points to block someone else from shaping the board in a specific way. It's not exactly the same, but it's a similar effect that you're accomplishing by mechanically integrating the scoring into the game in that way. Not
Yeah.
exactly the same, but it's close.
Definitely not. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And then yeah,
tell us your examples of this in the Discord for sure. That would be interesting because I'm
totally.
sure there are other ones out there. I was kind of thinking of like buying milestones in terraforming Mars or something like that, where like
Oh,
that doesn't really it's not giving me. I'm actually giving up the opportunity to build my engine more in order to
yeah.
like bank some points now.
A little bit in Kanagawa, I guess, when you could choose not to take a certain scoring in Kanagawa, there's sort of tiered objectives where the further you pursue a certain objective, the more points you're going to get, but you can't take the lower threshold objectives if you want to pursue the next one. So say you have to
But
collect 5 people. Once you get to 3 people, you could say, okay, I'll take 3 points. But if you do that, you can't then collect 5 people and then get 7 points. You have to choose if you get off the train.
but we're kind of falling off our premise here, right? Those are there, that is points as tokens. My example of Terraforming Mars is scoring track, and
Sure.
Dominion is still different, being purely points on cards that go
In
into
your
your
deck. Yep.
yeah. So
Yeah.
that's really unique and in a very cool way.
Yep.
So we were talking about points as money real quick. We kind of talked about that a little bit already with modern art. Another game I was thinking of, Brendan, is Five Tribes, which
Sure.
one thing I love about that game is you start with 50 coins and each coin is worth 1 point at the end of the game. So you start with 50 points. You're like, wow, that's crazy. But then you just have to spend them and kind of like invest them wisely over the course of the
Mm,
game to bid for turn order to, bank even more points.
yep.
Um, so that I don't know if how are you think of points as money as being a different scoring logistic from points as token? Maybe just that you start with it in many
Yeah,
cases.
I think it was just an example of trying to get this idea of it being mechanically integrated in some way. Though
Yeah,
in these cases, it's much less interesting than the Dominion example. It just felt like something I could flag a little bit,
yeah,
where it forces you to make these interesting decisions of, okay, I can give up this many points, I can decrease my score effectively, and will I get the return I expect?
yeah. It's still
You
like
know,
a token
yeah,
for scoring
facilitated.
logistics, but it's often used in a way where it's like the tokens, which are the scoring logistic, is going to be transferred a lot over the course
Yep.
of the game. We're going to be wheeling and dealing with these tokens.
Totally. Okay, another category that I could think of, Jake, was binary win-loss condition games. So no scoring. The scoring logistics are we're not going to score in this game. There's going to be some end
I'm just
game
going to make you
condition.
lose all 20 life.
Exactly. That's kind of like a score tracker tokens, right? 20 life is you still have to track it. But in
It's a
chess,
resource. Life is a resource, man.
exactly, you start with 20 life tokens, and then when you get to
I'm
0,
not blocking that. I still got 18 more life.
but in chess, game ends when I checkmate you, right? There's no endgame scoring, there's no counting throughout the course of play. It's typically clean and really dramatic because you know the winner immediately. There's no counting or waiting. In Pandemic, you win the game when you cure all the diseases. Boom, we won, right? This typically leads to a really dramatic ending and a dramatic course of play as the tension ramps up of, can we accomplish this end game objective? Can we accomplish this end game objective? The downside of this binary win-loss condition is we've talked about all these different types of scoring and how these different times that you score throughout the game give you feedback. You move up on a track, feedback from the game. Good job. You get to grab a clutch of tokens, feedback from the game. Good job. Scoring pads. At the end of the game, you can look and see what categories you did, get feedback about what you could do better. In chess, end of the game, checkmate. Not a lot of feedback from the game on what you should have done differently in terms of the scoring, in terms of win loss, right? And I think that's the downside, the cost of these dramatic, exciting endings that you get in a game like chess or Pandemic.
Yeah. I think race games would also
Yes,
often
totally.
fall into this category. Like Heat, Quantum, we've been playing recently. Keyforge, the Richard Garfield card game, could also be quantified as a race game, right? You're racing to forge 3 keys first. And I think what the kind of like interesting signpost is to players, or like the way this affects decision space, is truly that everything you're doing is like in service of this singular objective, right?
Yeah.
Which maybe sounds kind of funny because I guess in a different type of game, you'd be like, well, that's like your singular objective there is to score points. So, but I think having kind of like just this win loss binary makes that more like primary, more distinct and visible to players as they, begin to race towards that finish line or win state, whatever it is.
Sure. And there's ways, someone on the podcast, Jake, I know we have a listener who's saying, but Jake, a race game is just a score track that you play the game on, and every space is a point, and the player to get the most points wins. And it's sort of like, sure. Again, this is about presentation and your experience of what's there. So I think that it still really matters. And these binary win-loss condition games, Seven Wonders Duel is another one that comes to mind for me a little bit, Jake. That actually has token-based scoring in a way because there's victory points at the end. But then there's also binary win-loss conditions of science victory. If you set collect enough science tokens, you automatically win or lose if you're on the other side of the table. And then the same for the military. If you just get into the opponent's end zone of the military, you can lose immediately. And I think that something I love about that is you can typically see the win or the loss coming. You get really close, and then it becomes this moment of, can my opponent do it? So you get feedback on games about to end, or I'm about to win, or I'm about to lose. So it primes the player in terms of the dramatic arc of the game. Even if it's not giving you direct feedback about maybe what you did right or wrong, it's giving you feedback about the dramatic experience. And I think that that's where we should kind of shift this conversation to close.
Well,
Yeah, sorry.
I want to reply to our listener who's
Okay.
saying that about this, which I think, and maybe this does shift us to the end of the conversation too. But we established at the start of this episode, right, that
Yeah.
yes, you can probably use any type of scoring logistic in almost any game,
Sure.
but it's about picking the right one to create the type of gameplay environment that you want. So, like,
Yeah.
yes, it is true that every race game could just be a score track, right? You could picture Keyforge as a track to 4 spaces, and if you step on the 4th space,
You win.
you win. But that's not creating the same type of like emotional resonance with the
Yeah.
mechanics at play as having 3 keys that you're trying to forge, and once you forge the third one, congratulations, you've won the game.
Yeah.
So well, it is true, right? I think that is my kind of like takeaway from all this. Yes, you can use whatever type of scoring you want, but some might fit the game better, and some might, in fact, actually change the way that players approach the game. So that was what I was trying to talk about with kind of like the singular presence of reaching the finish line, kind of impacting actually the way the average player will engage with the game more
Totally.
technically. Yeah, it is the same.
Totally. And then when looking through this lens of scoring logistics at scoring in a game overall, if scoring is feedback in terms of the player experience of knowing when they've done well and when they've done poorly, the way in which you choose to sort of facilitate that through the scoring logistics is going to shape the narrative arc of the game, right? When Alan R. Moon in Ticket to Ride made the decision for players to not score their tickets until the end of the game, he was thinking about the narrative arc that the players are going to have in terms of their experience of who's winning when, who's losing, am I in this race, am I not in this race, and trying to craft the most interesting narrative arc with the scoring logistics of that game. A combination in that case of a scoring track that represents, 60% of the points in a typical game, 70%, 50%, it varies. And then the cards, the tickets in the ticket to ride representing the other percentage there. So that gives you the best of having nice feedback in terms of scoring along the way, having a sense of, is this how do people shape up in this race versus still having the climax at the end, the big reveal facilitated by the logistics of having those hidden cards. And I think that's ultimately what's most important here, right, in terms of scoring logistics. And that's the Knizia example again, Jake. You talking about how Knizia's quote that the scoring is the game, the scoring conditions are the game. The scoring logistics are the narrative arc in a way.
That's really good. I think as a closing thought, we should try and remember to consider scoring logistics in future deep dives.
I
We
think it's a good
already
idea.
talk about everything. What do we talk about with the decision space? What are our elements? The clarity, the type,
the size,
the size,
the feel.
the feel. Is it
Yeah,
feel?
I think so.
Well, I think after that, we should ask ourselves, what is the scoring logistics in this game?
Yeah.
And does that impact the decision space
I think that's
as we engage with it?
a great point, Jake. And I'll mention, a game that we're going to cover on the show sometime soon, maybe next episode, is Bunny Kingdom, this really cool drafting game from Richard Garfield that we're both playing almost entirely online. And I think a conversation about that game, absent of a discussion on scoring logistics, wouldn't be fair, because I've played that game online where the scoring is done for me. And that means that I'm not experiencing a whole sort of component of that game when playing on the table, which is tabulating your score by doing multiplication.
No.
That really alters the pacing of the game and the experience and your sensation of feedback, because it's less immediate than the computer just saying, this is how many points you get for this fife automatically.
Yeah, absolutely. Dang. Thanks for reminding me never to play that game on the table.
Yeah,
all right,
happy
Brent.
to.
Should we end it there this week? I know there's more we could talk about, but maybe we should save it for the Discord. We could kind of talk a little bit more there about everything we've talked about in this episode, and also perhaps get into a little bit more conversation about how these different types of scoring logistics interact with online play. Maybe some do a better job of it than others, or in some cases, right, online's really aiding it, where maybe in others, right, you're losing a lot of kind of that taking a token from somebody else. And then also kind of when scoring happens is another topic we have on our notes that we didn't get to that I think is really interesting here, which can also definitely impact the pace and feel and decision space of the game too, whether you've got scoring happening after every turn, at the end of rounds, or only at the end of the game. So a lot to discuss in our Discord, and I really hope that our listeners will join us there, where we'll be discussing this much more. And for those of you who have made it this far in the show, thank you so much. You're officially basically a super fan of the show. Definitely leave a review. If you want more things Decision Space, check out decisionspacepodcast.com. And if you want to play some of the games we'll probably be covering on the show soon, check out Bunny Kingdom. That's on Board Game Arena. We'll definitely cover Quantum, really cool, high randomness, high skill game. Taverns of Tiefenthal. We'll probably cover Ticket to Ride at some point. And then if we don't mention Food Chain Magnate, we're definitely covering it. We're covering it. And then Food Chain Magnate, which, our patrons, we are going to get it covered. We promise. December 31st, 2024. Oh my gosh. Imagine. And we should thank Hembry for our intro outro song, Reach Out. We'll see y'all next week. Bye.